Chapter 1. The Night Everything Stopped. The clock on the kitchen wall has a rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. It's a sound I usually don't notice. It's the heartbeat of a house that is supposed to be full. But tonight, the house is empty of everything but that sound. It started at 7 p.m. I remember the time because I was looking at the oven clock. I was waiting for the timer to go off for the potatoes. The steam from the pot was fogging up the window above the sink. Outside, the streetlights were flickering on, casting that pale, sickly orange glow onto the driveway. Everything was routine. Everything was safe. Elias was in his study. I heard him go in there an hour before. I heard the click of the door, not a slam, just a soft, heavy seating of wood against wood. I heard his chair creak. I heard the familiar tapping of his keyboard. These are the sounds of a marriage. They are the sounds of a life built on the assumption that tomorrow will look exactly like today. I set the table. 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 glasses of water. I even straightened the napkins. Then the silence started. It wasn't a sudden noise that alerted me. It was the absence of one. The tapping stopped. I waited for the chair to creak again. I waited for him to stand up, to stretch, to walk toward the kitchen because he smelled the rosemary. He didn't. I stood in the center of the kitchen, holding a serving spoon. The fridge hummed. The wind brushed against the siding of the house. But from the study, nothing. Most people, when they realize something is wrong, they feel a surge of adrenaline. They feel their heart race. I didn't feel that. I felt a coldness. A slow, creeping chill that started at the base of my spine and worked its way up to my skull. Elias! I called out. My voice sounded thin. It didn't carry. It felt like the house was absorbing the sound, swallowing it before it could reach the hallway. I walked toward the study. The hallway is narrow. It's lined with photos of us, hiking in the Adirondacks, our wedding day. A blurry shot of us laughing at a New Year's Eve party 3 years ago. In the dim light, our faces looked like strangers. I reached the door. Elias, dinner's ready. I waited. I pressed my ear to the wood. Usually, you can hear a person breathing if you listen closely enough. You can hear the rustle of clothes, the shift of weight. I heard nothing. It was a silence so absolute it felt heavy, like the air in the hallway had turned to water. I reached for the handle. I expected it to turn. Why wouldn't it turn? We don't lock doors in this house. There's no need to lock ourselves away from each other. I gripped the brass knob and twisted. It didn't budge. I tried again, harder this time. The metal bit into my palm. Locked. Elias, open the door. It isn't funny. I knocked, first softly, then louder. The sound of my knuckles against the oak echoed through the empty house. I went to the kitchen and grabbed the spare key from the junk drawer. My hands were shaking just a little. The silver key felt ice cold. I came back. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a sickeningly smooth click. I pushed the door open. The study was dark. The only light came from the computer monitor, which had gone into sleep mode, casting a rhythmic, pulsing blue glow across the room. The chair was empty. The window was shut and latched from the inside. The air was still. It didn't smell like him. It didn't smell like anything. I walked to the desk. His glasses were sitting right next to the mousepad. His coffee was still steaming, a thin ribbon of vapor rising into the blue light. I looked at the floor. I looked behind the curtains. I looked in the small closet where we keep the filing cabinet. Empty. He was gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty chair. My mind was trying to find a logical path. Maybe he slipped out. No, I was in the kitchen. The kitchen is the only way out of this wing of the house. To leave, he would have had to walk past me. I walked back to the door and looked at the mechanism. My breath hitched in my throat. The deadbolt was a manual turn piece. It can only be engaged from the inside. There is no way to lock this door from the hallway without a key, and I had the only spare. Elia's was gone, but the door was locked from the inside. Chapter 2, No Footprints. The blue and red lights did something strange to the living room. They turned the familiar walls into a strobe light of emergency. Blue, red, blue, red. It was a rhythmic pulse that felt like a headache beginning to bloom behind my eyes. I sat on the edge of the sofa, my hands tucked under my thighs to keep them from shaking. I wasn't cold, but I was shivering. It was the kind of shivering that comes from the inside out, a vibration of the bones. The front door was wide open. The night air was pushing its way into the house, smelling of damp earth and the neighbor's chimney smoke. Officer Miller was the first one there. He was young, with a face that still looked like it belonged in a high school yearbook, but his eyes were tired. He had spent the last 20 minutes walking through every room of the house. He walked softly, as if he were afraid of waking someone up. He came back into the living room, flipping his notebook shut. "Mrs. Thorne," he said. His voice was too loud for the room. "You're sure he didn't mention going out? A quick trip to the store, a walk." "His keys are on the hook," I said. I didn't look at him. I looked at the rug. "His wallet is in his coat pocket in the hall. His glasses are on the desk. Elia's can't see the end of his own arm without his glasses." Miller nodded slowly. He looked toward the hallway that led to the study. "And the door was locked, you're certain?" "I had to use the spare key," I whispered. I heard a heavy footstep on the porch. A second man entered. He was older, wearing a tan trench coat that looked like it had been lived in. He didn't introduce himself immediately. He just stood in the entryway, looking at the house. He looked at the pictures on the walls. He looked at the 2 plates still sitting on the kitchen table, the potatoes now cold and gray in their bowls. "Detective Vance," Miller said, acknowledging him. Vance didn't say anything to Miller. He walked straight to the study. I stayed on the couch, but I listened. I listened to the way the floorboards groaned under his weight. I heard him testing the window. Clack, clack, the sound of the latches being checked. "No forced entry," Vance's voice drifted back from the hallway. It was a gravelly, low-frequency sound. "Screens are intact. Dust on the sills hasn't been disturbed." I felt a bead of sweat slide down my ribcage. Vance walked back into the living room. He didn't sit down. He stood over me, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made the room feel much smaller. "The neighbors," Vance said. "The Gables to the left, the Millers to the right. Officer Miller spoke to them. They were home all evening. Mrs. Gable was on her porch from 6 to 8. She says she didn't see anyone leave this house. She didn't see anyone enter." "I didn't see anyone either," I said. "I was in the kitchen. I would have seen him walk past." "Right," Vance said. He pulled a pen from his pocket and clicked it. Click, click. "The kitchen. It's the only way out of that part of the house, isn't it? Unless he jumped out a closed, locked window and then latched it behind him from the outside." I looked up at him. His eyes were gray, like the sky before a storm. "That's impossible," I said. "It is," Vance agreed. "Which leaves us with a bit of a puzzle. A man goes into a room. The door is locked from the inside. The windows are locked from the inside. The wife is 10 feet away in the kitchen, and yet the man is gone." The silence that followed was heavy. It was the kind of silence that demands to be filled with an explanation, but I didn't have one. "Did you hear any shouting?" Vance asked. "A struggle, a heavy thud." "No, it was quiet. It was unnervingly quiet." "Quiet," Vance repeated. He looked at the kitchen table. "You made dinner for 2. "I always do." "And you called him at 7:14. No, I noticed the time at 7:14. I called him a few minutes later. Vance nodded. He began to walk a slow circle around the living room. He stopped at a small side table where a vase of dried flowers sat. He touched a petal. It crumbled. "We'll need to do a more thorough sweep," Vance said. "Check for prints, though I suspect we'll only find yours and his. This is a very clean house, Mrs. Thorne. Very orderly." "Elias likes things in their place," I said. "And where is his place right now?" Vance asked, his voice dropping an octave. I didn't answer. I couldn't. "Officer Miller," Vance said, not taking his eyes off me. "Go back outside. Check the perimeter again. Look for footprints. The ground is soft from the rain this afternoon. If someone stepped off that porch or near those windows, they would have left a mark. A deep one." Miller nodded and disappeared. Vance sat down in the armchair opposite me. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know," he said softly, "in my experience, people don't just evaporate. Matter cannot be destroyed. It can only change form. If your husband isn't in that room, he went somewhere. And if he went somewhere, he left a trail." "There is no trail," I said. My voice felt like it was coming from someone else, someone far away. "We'll see," Vance said. 10 minutes later, Miller came back. His boots were slightly muddy. He looked puzzled. "Nothing, sir," Miller said. Vance turned his head. "Nothing." "The flower beds under the study window are untouched. The mulch hasn't been disturbed. No footprints in the side yard. No tire tracks in the driveway other than yours and mine. It's like—" Miller hesitated. "Like what?" Vance prodded. "Like he never stepped foot outside." Vance turned his gaze back to me. The look wasn't one of sympathy anymore. It was curiosity. The kind of curiosity a scientist has for a specimen under a microscope. "No footprints," Vance whispered. "No forced entry. No fingerprints on the window latches. A locked door." He stood up slowly. "Mrs. Thorne, I'm going to need you to come down to the station tomorrow morning, just to give a formal statement, to clear up the timeline." "Am I a suspect?" I asked. The word felt like a stone in my mouth. Vance smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was a professional smile. "It's a missing person case, Mrs. Thorne. In the first 24 hours, everyone is a person of interest, especially the last person to see them." He walked toward the door, then stopped. He turned back to look at the hallway leading to the study. "One more thing," Vance said. "That silence you mentioned, the one that filled the house before you found him gone." "Yes." Was it the kind of silence that happens when someone leaves? Or the kind that happens when someone is hiding? I didn't have an answer. They left then. The red and blue lights faded from the walls, replaced by the yellow glow of the street lamp. I was alone again. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. I picked up the 2 plates of cold potatoes. I carried them to the trash can and scraped them in. Thud, thud. The sound was too loud. I looked at the hallway. The door to the study was still open. The blue light from the computer monitor was still pulsing. Blink, blink, blink. I walked to the study door. I stood on the threshold. I didn't want to go in, but I couldn't help it. I looked at the floor where Vance said there were no footprints. I looked at the window where Miller said there were no marks. Then I looked at the chair. On the seat of the chair, there was a small indentation, just a slight dip in the fabric, as if someone had been sitting there only seconds ago. I reached out and touched the seat. It was still warm. My heart didn't race. It didn't pound. It just seemed to skip a beat, a momentary lapse in the rhythm of my life. I backed out of the room. I closed the door. I didn't lock it this time. I went to our bedroom, my bedroom, and lay down on top of the covers. I kept the lights on. I listened to the house, A house is never truly silent. There are the pipes, the settling of the foundation, the wind, but tonight the house felt like it was holding its breath. It felt like it was watching me. As I drifted into a fitful, shallow sleep, a thought surfaced from the back of my mind, cold and sharp as a needle. Vance was right. People don't evaporate, but if Elias didn't leave, and he isn't here, then who was I talking to through the door? Chapter 3: The Things Left Behind. Morning did not bring clarity, it only brought a harsher light. The sun spilled across the kitchen floor in long, indifferent slats. It highlighted the dust motes dancing in the air, skin cells, fabric fibers, the microscopic debris of a life lived. I made coffee. It was a reflex. I filled the pot to the 2 mark, just like I have every morning for 8 years. When the machine finished its hissing and popping, I reached for 2 mugs. I stopped. My hand hovered over the ceramic handle of Elias' favorite blue mug. I pulled my hand back. The silence of the house felt louder in the daylight. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the night before, it was a thin, hollow silence, like the sound inside a bleached bone. I walked back to the study. The police had told me not to touch anything, but they hadn't taped it off. They didn't think it was a crime scene yet, not officially. To them, it was a mysterious departure. I stood in the doorway. The room looked different in the sun. The blue light of the monitor was drowned out by the morning, leaving the screen looking like a dead, black eye. I began to take an inventory, not of what was missing, but of what remained. His phone was on the corner of the desk. It was plugged into the white charging cable. I pressed the home button. The screen lit up. 84% charged. There were 3 missed calls, all from me. There were 2 text messages, one from his brother asking about a lawnmower and one from a work colleague about a spreadsheet. He hadn't taken his phone. Nobody leaves voluntarily without their phone, not in this world. It's our tether. It's our map, our money, our memory. To leave it behind is to leave behind your identity. I moved to the closet. His shoes were lined up in perfect rows. His hiking boots, his dress shoes, his sneakers. I counted them. Every pair was accounted for. I looked at the coat rack in the hall, his heavy winter parka, his light windbreaker, his umbrella, all there. I went back to the desk. I opened the top drawer. It slid open with a dry wooden protest. Inside were the mundane artifacts of a quiet man. A box of paper clips, a stack of postage stamps, a spare set of house keys, a receipt for a car wash from 3 weeks ago. And then, at the very back, under a stack of empty file folders, I saw the black spine of his journal. Elias wasn't a poet. He wasn't a man of many words, but he was a man of observation. He kept a log, not a diary of feelings, but a record of facts. The weather, the birds he saw at the feeder, the progress of the garden. I took the journal to the armchair and sat down. My heart was a slow, steady drum in my chest. Thump, thump, thump. I flipped through the pages. October 14th, overcast, high of 52, saw a red-tailed hawk on the power line, need to clear the gutters. October 20th, first frost, the marigolds are done. Noticed a draft in the hallway near the cellar door. November 3rd, changed the oil in the Honda. 42,000 miles, dinner with Sarah, she seemed tired. I paused at the last entry. He had noticed I was tired. I didn't remember being tired, I remembered being quiet. I turned to the final page. The date was yesterday, November 12th. The handwriting was different. Usually, Elias wrote in a tight architectural print, very straight, very clean. But this entry was rushed. The ink was smeared in places as if he hadn't waited for it to dry before moving his hand. November 12th. It began. The sound is back. It isn't the wind. It isn't the pipes. It's coming from the center of the house. I checked the walls again. Nothing. But when I put my ear to the plaster, I can hear the heartbeat. It isn't mine. I felt the air leave my lungs. I thought I was imagining the shadows. I thought it was just the trick of the light in an old house. But the dimensions are wrong. I measured the hallway. It's 4 inches shorter than it was last month. I looked up at the hallway. It looked the same. It looked as it always had. Narrow, dim. I returned to the page. I told Sarah I was going to work. I didn't want to frighten her. She doesn't see it yet. She doesn't see how the house is folding in on itself. If I can find the source, I can stop it. I think it's behind The sentence stopped. There was no period, no closing remark. The pen had simply dragged across the paper in a sharp, diagonal line, as if the book had been pulled away from him, or as if he had been pulled away from the book. I stared at the unfinished sentence. I think it's behind Behind what? The wall? The door? I turned the page, hoping for more. The next page was blank, and the next, and the next. I flipped all the way to the end of the book. On the very last page, written in the very bottom corner in tiny, cramped letters that I almost missed, was a single sentence. It wasn't in Elia's handwriting. The letters were jagged. They looked like they had been carved into the paper rather than written on it. The ink was so dark it was almost purple. It said, "If you're reading this, I was wrong." I dropped the book. It hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. I was wrong. About what? The house? The shadows? The heartbeat? Or was he wrong about me? I stood up, my legs feeling like they were made of water. I looked at the walls of the study. I had lived in this house for 6 years. I knew every crack in the ceiling. I knew which floorboards squeaked. But as I stood there, the room felt unfamiliar. The corners seemed sharper. The ceiling seemed lower. I walked to the wall behind the desk. I pressed my palm against the wallpaper. It was a pale, floral pattern, lilies and vines. It was cold. I leaned in. I pressed my ear against the wall, just as Elias had described. I held my breath. I stayed perfectly still. At first, there was nothing. Just the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. Then I heard it. Thump. A long pause. Thump. It wasn't a heartbeat, not a human one. It was too slow, too heavy. It sounded like something massive moving deep underground. I pulled away from the wall. My gaze fell on the computer monitor again. The black screen. I saw my own reflection in the glass. I looked pale. My eyes looked dark, like 2 holes burned into a sheet of paper. And then I noticed something in the reflection. In the reflection of the room behind me, the study door was closed. But I hadn't closed it. I always leave the door open. I don't like being enclosed. I turned around slowly. The door was shut. I walked to it. I grabbed the handle. I already knew what I would find. I twisted. Locked. I wasn't scared. That was the strangest part. I didn't scream. I didn't pound on the wood. I just stood there, my forehead pressed against the cool oak. I realized then that the house wasn't just a place where we lived. It was a witness, and it had finally decided to speak. I looked back at the journal on the floor. If you're reading this, I was wrong. I whispered the words aloud. They felt heavy in the air. Wrong about what, Elias? From the other side of the door, in the hallway where I had been standing only moments ago, I heard a sound. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping. The sound of a keyboard. Tap, 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 tap. And then the sound of a chair creaking as someone sat back to stretch. I didn't open the door. I couldn't, because I knew that if I opened that door, I wouldn't find Elias. I would find the version of him that the house had kept. And I wasn't ready to see what the house did to the things it took. Chapter 4, The First Lie. The police station smelled like industrial floor cleaner and stale coffee. It was a flat, gray smell that seemed to coat the back of my throat. I sat in a room that was too small for 3 people, yet there were only 2 of us. Detective Vance sat across from me. He hadn't changed his coat. He looked like he hadn't slept, though his eyes were as sharp as shards of flint. He wasn't holding a pen today, he was just watching me. "Memory is a funny thing, Sarah," he said. He used my first name for the first time. It felt like a boundary being crossed. "It isn't a video recording. It's more like a painting. Every time you look at it, you touch it up. You add a little color here, you blur a detail there." "I told you everything I remember," I said. My voice was steady. I had practiced being steady in the car. I had looked at myself in the rearview mirror and repeated the timeline until the words lost all meaning. 7:14 p.m. The oven clock, the steam, the silence. "Most people," Vance said, leaning back, the plastic chair groaning under his weight, "tell me about the good times when someone goes missing. They show me the highlight reel. They want to prove the person had every reason to stay." He paused. He let the silence sit between us like a third guest. "But no marriage is a highlight reel. Tell me about the arguments." I looked at the fluorescent light fixture above his head. It flickered. A tiny, rhythmic hum came from the ballast. Bzzz, bzzz, bzzz. "We didn't argue much," I said. That was the first lie. In my head, a memory surfaced. It wasn't a painting. It was a jagged, sharp-edged piece of glass. It was 3 nights ago. Tuesday. The rain was lashing against the kitchen window. Elias was standing by the sink, holding a glass of water. He wasn't drinking it. He was just staring at the reflection of the stove in the dark pane of the window. "I feel like I'm leaking," he had said. His voice had been so low I almost missed it over the sound of the rain. "What do you mean, Elias?" I had asked. I was drying a plate. I remember the weight of the ceramic in my hand. "The edges," he whispered. "The edges of me. They're getting soft." I walk into a room and I forget if I'm the one walking, or if the room is just moving around me. I had laughed. It was a small, nervous sound. "You're overworked, Elias. You need sleep." He had turned to look at me then. His eyes, usually so full of a quiet, steady intelligence, looked hollow, like a house with the lights turned off. "You don't see it, do you?" he asked. "You're the one doing it. You're looking right through me. Even now, you're looking at the plate. You're looking at the clock. You never look at me." The argument hadn't been loud. There was no shouting. There was no breaking of glass. It was worse. It was a cold, surgical dismantling of our life. He told me I was turning him into a ghost long before he actually vanished. He told me that I didn't love him. I loved the habit of him. And I had said something back. Something cruel. Something about how he was lucky I stayed at all, given how much space his silence took up in the house. I didn't tell Vance about that. "We had our disagreements," I said instead. "But he was happy. We were planning a trip to the coast in the spring." Vance nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He reached into a manila folder and pulled out a photograph. It was a photo of the study door, the one I had opened with the spare key. "We ran the lock," Vance said. "It's a standard Schlage deadbolt. Manual. You were right. It can't be locked from the outside without a key." "Yes, I know." "And you have the only spare." "Yes, it stays in the junk drawer in the kitchen." Vance tapped the photo. We checked the drawer. There's an indentation in the dust where a key used to sit, but we also found something else, under the liner of the drawer. He pulled out a second photo. It was a small, silver object, a wedding ring. My breath caught. I felt my hand instinctively move to my own ring finger, touching the gold band that lived there. "It's his," Vance said. "We found it tucked under the plastic lining, deep in the back, not dropped, hidden." I stared at the photo. I didn't know it was there, I said. This was the second lie. I had found that ring 3 weeks ago. It was sitting on the edge of the bathroom sink. I had picked it up, expecting it to be warm from his skin. It was cold. I had asked him about it that night. Elias, you left your ring by the sink. He hadn't looked up from his book. It doesn't fit anymore, Sarah. My fingers are thinning. It keeps sliding off. I didn't want to lose it down the drain. But when I tried to give it back to him, he wouldn't take it. He looked at it with a kind of revulsion, as if I were holding a dead insect. Keep it, he had said. Put it somewhere safe. I don't want to see it for a while. I had hidden it in the junk drawer. I told myself I was keeping it safe. But really, I was hiding the evidence that he was shrinking, that he was detached from the promise we had made. Why would he hide his ring, Sarah? Vance asked. His voice was very soft now, almost kind. I don't know, I whispered. It looks like a man preparing to leave, Vance said. A man shedding his skin, piece by piece. First the ring, then the phone, then the body. He leaned forward. But the door was locked from the inside. That's the part that bothers me. If a man wants to leave, he walks out the door. He doesn't lock himself in a room and then vanish into thin air. Unless what? Unless he didn't leave, Vance said. Unless he's still in that house. In a way we haven't figured out yet. I thought about the heartbeat in the wall. I thought about the sound of the typing I had heard through the door. Memory is unreliable, I said, repeating his words back to him. It is, Vance agreed. Which is why I find it interesting that you told Officer Miller yesterday that Elias was wearing his ring when he went into the study. I froze. Did I say that? I tried to reach back into the fog of the previous night, the red and blue lights, the shivering. He was wearing his blue sweater, I had told Miller. His glasses, his ring. He always wears his ring. Why did I say that? I knew the ring was in the drawer. I had put it there myself. I looked at Vance. He was watching the way my pupils dilated. He was reading the micro movements of my face. I was mistaken, I said. I was in shock. I assumed. Right, Vance said. Assumed. He closed the folder. You can go, Sarah, for now, but I want you to think, not about the highlight reel, not about the painting. I want you to think about the cracks, the things that didn't fit, the things you're trying to protect him from. He stood up and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the knob. And Sarah, one more thing. Yes. When we searched the study, we found a smudge on the inside of the window, a partial palm print. My heart hammered once hard against my ribs. Was it Elia's S? I asked. Vance looked at me for a long beat. No, he said. It was too small. It looked like a woman's hand. And it was positioned as if someone were trying to push the window open from the outside. But the latches were locked from the inside. He opened the door. Have a good day, Sarah. I walked out of the station into the bright, unfeeling afternoon. I got into my car. I didn't start the engine. I looked at my right hand. The palm. There was a small, faint red mark in the center of it, a bruise. The kind of bruise you get when you press your hand with all your weight against something hard and unyielding. Like a window, I didn't remember being outside last night. I remembered being in the kitchen. I remembered the steam. I remembered the potatoes. But as I sat in the car, a new memory began to form. It was blurry, like a dream you forget the moment you wake up. A memory of standing in the flower bed. The cold mud seeping into my socks, the smell of damp earth. A memory of looking through the study window at Elias. He was sitting at his desk. He wasn't typing. He was just sitting there perfectly still. And in the memory, I was screaming. I was pounding on the glass, trying to get him to see me. but he didn't look. He couldn't hear me, because in that memory, the room was empty, and I was the one who wasn't there. Chapter 5. The House Remembers. The key felt heavy in my hand, heavier than it should. I stood on the porch for a long time, watching the sun dip below the line of the neighbor's roof. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, purple, gray, and a sickly, fading yellow. I didn't want to go inside. When a person goes missing, the house they leave behind becomes a monument. Every object they touched becomes a relic. Every space they occupied becomes a vacuum, pulling at the air, trying to suck you in. I pushed the door open. The house was cold. I had turned the heat up to 72 before I left for the station, but the air felt thin, as if the insulation had vanished and left me exposed to the marrow of the earth. I didn't turn on the lights. Not yet. I stood in the entryway and listened. A house is never truly still. There is the settling of timber, the contraction of copper pipes, the hum of the refrigerator, but these were the sounds of a living house. This house sounded expectant. I walked into the kitchen. I didn't want to look at the junk drawer. I didn't want to think about the ring hidden under the liner. I didn't want to think about the palm print on the outside of the glass. I filled the kettle. The sound of the water hitting the metal bottom was deafening. Clatter, splash, roar. I set it on the stove and clicked the burner. The blue flame flared up, casting a ring of dancing shadows against the backsplash. I sat at the table. I waited for the whistle. While I waited, I looked at the hallway. The door to the study was closed again. I knew I had left it open. I remembered the way the light from the hallway had spilled across the carpet of the study. I remembered looking at the empty chair. But now it was shut. I didn't move. I watched the door. There was no draft in the house. The windows were sealed. The basement door was bolted. There was no physical reason for that door to move. And then I heard it. Click, the sound of a latch, not the study door. The sound came from behind me. I turned slowly. The cellar door, located in the small pantry off the kitchen, was standing half open. A sliver of absolute darkness peeked out from the gap. I felt a prickle of electricity run across my scalp. I had bolted that door before I left. I remember the slide of the brass bolt. I remember the resistance of the wood. I stood up. My knees felt stiff. I walked toward the pantry. The kettle began to simmer. A low, vibrating hum that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of my feet. I reached the cellar door. I put my hand on the wood. It was cold. Not just basement cold, but ice cold. Like the surface of a frozen lake. I pushed it shut. I slid the bolt home. Clack! I turned back to the stove. The kettle was starting to whistle, a thin, rising shriek that filled the kitchen. I reached for the handle, but I stopped. The whistle didn't sound like steam escaping a metal vent. It sounded like a voice. It was a high, thin pitch oscillating between two notes. If I listened closely, too closely, it sounded like someone trying to scream through a mouthful of water. Sa-ra. I pulled the kettle off the heat. The sound died instantly. The silence that followed was so sudden it felt like a physical blow. I stood there, clutching the plastic handle of the kettle, my breath coming in short, jagged bursts. "It's the wind," I whispered. The house didn't believe me. I carried my tea into the living room and sat in the dark. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't pick up a book. I just sat. That was when the shifting started. At first, it was just the shadows. The street lamp outside cast the shadow of the maple tree onto the living room wall. Usually, the branches swayed in the wind. But tonight, the shadows weren't swaying. They were reaching. The black lines of the branches seemed to stretch across the wallpaper, growing longer, moving independently of the wind. They crawled toward the ceiling. They curled around the crown molding. I blinked and they were back to normal. But then I looked at the armchair. Elia's armchair. In the dim light, the fabric looked wet. I stood up and walked toward it. I reached out a hand, but I stopped before I touched it. There was a depression in the cushion, a deep, heavy sink as if someone much heavier than Elia's was sitting there right now. I watched the fabric. It was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the cushion was rising and falling. In, out, the chair was breathing. I backed away, my heart finally beginning to trip over itself. Thud, 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 thud. I ran for the stairs. I didn't look back. I didn't look at the cellar door. I didn't look at the study. I got to the bedroom and slammed the door. I locked it. I leaned my back against the wood, gasping for air. This was my room, our room. The bed was made. The duvet was smooth. The air smelled like my lavender spray and his cedarwood cologne. I felt a momentary sense of relief. This was the one place the house couldn't touch. This was the sanctuary. I walked to the bed and pulled back the covers. I froze. In the center of the white bottom sheet, there were two distinct marks. Footprints. But they weren't the footprints of a man. They weren't the footprints of a person at all. They were large, hand-shaped marks, as if someone had stood on the bed using their palms. The impressions were deep, pressed into the mattress as if by a great weight. And they were made of fine, gray dust. I touched the dust. It felt like ash. I looked at the ceiling above the bed. There, directly over the spot where I sleep, was a single, dark smudge. I climbed onto the bed to get a closer look. It wasn't a smudge. It was a name. It had been traced into the white paint of the ceiling with a finger. The letters were faint, visible only because of the way the light from the bedside lamp hit the texture of the paint. It didn't say Elia's. It didn't say Sarah. It was a name I had never seen before. A name that felt like a cold stone in my gut. Malachi. I stared at it. Who was Malachi? I felt a sudden, violent urge to scream, but the sound died in my throat. Because from the other side of the bedroom door, the door I had just locked, I heard a sound. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of a fingernail, slowly, methodically scratching against the wood. Scritch, 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 and then a voice. It wasn't Elia's voice. It wasn't the high-pitched whistle of the kettle. It was a low, resonant vibration that I felt in my teeth. "You're late, Sarah," the voice said. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice cracking. The scratching stopped. "I'm the part of the house you forgot," the voice said. I grabbed the handle of the door. I didn't know why. I was terrified, but I was also angry. This was my home. This was my life. I twisted the lock and flung the door open. The hallway was empty. The air was still. But at the far end of the hall, near the study, I saw something. A small, silver object was sliding across the floorboards. It was moving slowly, as if being pushed by an invisible hand. It stopped in front of the study door. I walked toward it, my legs numb. I looked down. It was Elia's wedding ring. The one I had hidden in the junk drawer. The one the police had photographed. It was back. I picked it up. It was hot, so hot it nearly blistered my skin. I looked at the study door. From inside, I heard the sound of the keyboard again. Tap, 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 but this time it was faster, violent. I realized then that the house wasn't remembering Elia's. The house was replacing him. And as I looked down at the ring in my hand, I saw that the gold was beginning to change. The metal was bubbling, shifting, reshaping itself. The name engraved on the inside wasn't Elia's. It was Malachi. I dropped the ring. It didn't make a sound when it hit the floor. It just vanished into the shadow of the door. I stood in the hallway, the silence pressing against my ears until they ached. The house was no longer a witness. It was a participant. And I was the only thing left that didn't belong. Chapter 6. A name that shouldn't exist. The sun did not rise the next morning. A thick woolen fog had settled over the valley, pressing against the windows like a physical weight. The light that filtered through was gray and featureless. It didn't cast shadows, it just made everything look like a faded photograph. I stayed in bed until the clock read 9:00 a.m. I didn't want to move. If I moved, the day would begin. If the day began, I would have to acknowledge the name on the ceiling. Malachi. The word tasted like copper in my mouth. I finally stood up. I didn't look at the ceiling. I dressed in the dark, pulling on a heavy wool sweater and jeans. My movements were slow, deliberate. I felt like I was moving through waist-deep water. I went to the kitchen. I didn't make coffee. The thought of the kettle's whistle made my skin crawl. Instead, I went to the hallway closet. It's the closet where we keep the things that don't have a home. The vacuum cleaner, the winter coats, and at the very back, behind the stack of extra blankets, the before boxes. We all have them. The cardboard containers that hold the life you lived before you became the person you are now. I pulled out the box labeled ELIAS Personal. I carried it to the living room floor and sat cross-legged. The cardboard was dry and brittle. It smelled of basement damp and old tape. I opened it. Inside were the expected things. A high school diploma. A handful of medals from a track team I didn't know he was on. A stack of letters from his mother, bound with a rubber band that had long since snapped and turned to dust. I sifted through them. I was looking for a ghost. Halfway down the box, I found a leather-bound folder. It was tucked inside a larger envelope addressed to Elias from a law firm in a city 3 states away. I opened the folder. Inside was a document on heavy, cream-colored paper. It was a deed of trust. A property record for a house, our house. I frowned. We had bought this house together 6 years ago. We had signed the papers in a bright, modern office with a realtor named Martha. But this document was dated 20 years ago, and the name on the deed wasn't Elias Thorne. It was Malachi Thorne. I felt a coldness settle in my stomach. A Thorne, a relative. Elias had never mentioned a Malachi. He told me his father's name was David. He told me he was an only child. I turned the page. Underneath the deed was a birth certificate. It was a standard government form, but the ink was slightly blurred as if the printer had been running low on toner. Name, Malachi Thorne. Date of birth, May 12th. Mother, Martha Thorne. Father, David Thorne, May 12th. That was Elia's birthday. I stared at the paper until the letters began to swim. I felt a wave of vertigo so strong I had to put my hand flat on the floor to keep from tipping over. Same parents, same birthday, different name. I reached back into the box, my hands trembling now. I pulled out a stack of old Polaroids. They were loose, the edges yellowed and curled. The first one was of a young boy, maybe 7 years old. He was standing in front of this house. The porch looked newer, the maple tree was just a sapling. The boy was Elias. There was no mistaking the shape of the eyes, the slight tilt of the chin. I turned the photo over. Written in faded blue ink was, Malachi, summer 94. I looked at the next photo. It was a group shot, a birthday party. 5 or 6 children sat around a table. A cake with 7 candles sat in the center. And there, sitting next to the boy who looked like Elias, was another boy. They were identical. They were twins. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my temples. A memory, or something like a memory, tried to push its way through the fog of my mind. A dark room, a sound of splashing water, a heavy silence. I pushed it back. I couldn't look at it. I looked at the third photo. It was just the 2 of them. They were standing on the stairs of the cellar. The door was open behind them, revealing that same absolute darkness I had seen last night. The boy on the left, Elias, was smiling. The boy on the right, Malachi, wasn't. He was looking directly at the camera. His eyes were wide, dark, and flat. He looked less like a child and more like an adult wearing a child's skin. I looked at the last photo in the stack. It was a photo of the study. The desk was there, the chair was there. But sitting in the chair was the boy, Malachi. He was older now, maybe 17. He was looking at the window, the same window where the police had found the palm print. On the glass of the window, written in the frost of a winter night, was a single word: erased. I dropped the photos. They scattered across the rug like autumn leaves. "Elias," I whispered, "who were you?" The house didn't answer. I stood up and walked to the hallway. I felt a strange compulsion to go back to the study. The door was closed. I didn't use the key this time. I didn't have to. I just leaned my head against the wood. "Elias." No answer. "Malachi." The air in the hallway suddenly grew still. The hum of the refrigerator stopped. The muffled sound of the wind outside died away. From behind the door, I heard a voice. It wasn't a whisper. It was a resonance. "He's not here, Sarah." "Where is he?" "He's where he's always been," the voice said. "In the spaces between." "I don't understand." "You do," the voice said. It sounded closer now, as if the person were standing right on the other side of the wood, their lips inches from my ear. "You're the one who chose which one to keep." I backed away from the door. I chose. My mind raced. 6 years of marriage. 6 years of routine. 6 years of a man who was quiet, steady, and predictable. But there were moments. Moments when Elias would stare at his reflection in the mirror for too long. Moments when he would stop mid-sentence and look at the corner of the room as if someone had just entered. Moments when he would ask me, "Do I look like myself today, Sarah?" I had always laughed. I had always said, "Of course you do, Elias. Who else would you be?" I realized now that it wasn't a joke. It was a plea. I walked back to the living room and looked at the birth certificate again. I noticed something I had missed before. At the very bottom of the page, in the section for special notes, there was a stamp from the coroner's office. It was faint, almost illegible. Deceased. June 14, 1999. Malachi Thorne was dead. He had been dead for over 20 years. If Malachi was dead, then who had been living in this house with me? Who had I been cooking for? Who had I been sleeping next to? I felt a sudden, cold realization wash over me. The man I called Elias didn't have a brother. He didn't have a twin. He had a ghost. And the ghost was tired of being the one who was left behind. I looked at the photo of the 2 boys on the cellar stairs. I looked at the boy who wasn't smiling. I realized then that the face in the photo wasn't the face of a brother. It was the face Elias wore when he thought I wasn't looking. The past wasn't bleeding into the present. The present was being pulled back into the past. I heard a footstep upstairs. A heavy, deliberate footstep. Then another. Someone was walking in the bedroom. My bedroom. I stood at the base of the stairs, my heart a cold stone in my chest. "Elias." I called out. The footsteps stopped. A moment later, a voice drifted down from the landing. It was calm. It was slow. It was perfectly, terrifyingly familiar. "Elias is gone, Sarah," the voice said. "He was always so fragile. He couldn't hold the shape of this house anymore." A figure appeared at the top of the stairs. The fog from outside seemed to follow him, swirling around his feet. He was wearing Elias' blue sweater. He was wearing Elias' glasses, but his eyes were wide, dark, and flat. He looked down at me and smiled. "But don't worry," he said. "I remember everything. I remember the potatoes. I remember the rosemary. I remember the way you look at the clock instead of me." He began to walk down the stairs. "Who are you?" I gasped, backing into the kitchen. He stopped on the bottom step. He tilted his head to the side, a gesture that was so perfectly Elias it made my breath catch. I'm the one you invited in, he said. The night you decided that a quiet man was better than a real one. He stepped into the light of the kitchen. He had no shadow. The sun didn't rise that day. And I realized with a chilling certainty that it might never rise again. Chapter 7, The Witness. The figure at the top of the stairs didn't descend. He didn't move at all. He simply stood there, a silhouette carved out of the gray morning light, until my eyes ached from the strain of looking. I blinked just once and the landing was empty. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the heavy, expectant silence of the night before. It was sharp. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath in the tall grass. I didn't go up the stairs. I couldn't. Instead, I went to the front door. I needed air. I needed to see a world that wasn't made of shifting shadows and names written in ash. I stepped onto the porch. The fog was even thicker now. It was a white wall that had swallowed the street, the trees, and the houses across the way. I could barely see the edge of my own driveway. Mrs. Thorne. The voice made me jump. My heart executed a painful, jagged somersault in my chest. Standing at the base of my porch steps was Mrs. Gable. She lived 3 houses down. She was a woman who lived for her garden and the perceived sins of her neighbors. Usually she was armed with pruning shears and a judgmental scowl. Today she looked small. She was wrapped in a beige cardigan that she kept clutching at the throat, her knuckles white. "Mrs. Gable," I said, my voice sounding raspy. "I didn't see you there." "I've been waiting," she whispered. She kept looking past me, toward the darkened windows of my house. I didn't want to knock. I didn't want to disturb anything. "The police already spoke to you, didn't they?" "They did," she said. She stepped up one limb of the stairs, leaning in close. She smelled of mothballs and peppermint. "But I didn't tell them everything. I couldn't. They wouldn't have understood. They're young men, Mrs. Thorne. They believe in things you can touch, things you can put in a bag and label." I felt a cold prickle of dread. What didn't you tell them? Mrs. Gable looked left, then right, into the white void of the fog. "Last night," she began, her voice trembling, "after the sirens left, after the lights went dark, I couldn't sleep. I was sitting in my breakfast nook, looking out at your side yard." I waited, I didn't breathe. "I saw him," she said. You saw Elias leave." She shook her head slowly. Her eyes were wide, the pupils pinpricks in the gray light. "It wasn't Mr. Thorne, not really. It was someone in his clothes, the blue sweater, the dark slacks, but it wasn't him." "What do you mean?" "The way he moved," she whispered. "He came out of the cellar bulkhead. You know, the wooden doors in the back. He didn't walk, not like a man walks. He unfolded, like a piece of paper being flattened out. He stood in the yard for a long time, just looking at the study window." My mind went to the palm print, the bruise on my own hand. And then, I urged. "Then he looked at me," Mrs. Gable said. She let out a small, hitching sob. "He didn't have a face, Mrs. Thorne, not a real one." It was like someone had sketched a face onto a balloon and then let the air out. It was sagging. It was wrong. I felt the porch railing beneath my hand. It felt slick, as if it were sweating. "He walked toward my house," she continued. "I hid under the table. I'm an old woman. I'm not ashamed to say I was terrified. I heard him on my porch. I heard him touching the glass of my door, and then I heard him say it." "Say what?" Mrs. Gable looked up at me, tears finally spilling over her wrinkled cheeks. "He said my name, but he used my maiden name, a name I haven't gone by in 40 years, a name no one in this town knows." She grabbed my sleeve. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "That thing isn't your husband, Sarah. That thing is the house. It's been here a long time. It knows us." It's been watching us from the walls since before you were born. That's impossible, I said, though the word felt hollow. Is it? She asked. Then where is Elias, truly? Is he gone, or is he just underneath, like a layer of paint that's been covered up? She let go of my arm and backed away, disappearing into the fog before I could say another word. I heard her footsteps on the pavement, quick, light, and frantic. I stood alone on the porch. The fog seemed to press closer. I felt watched, not just by the house behind me, but by the very air. Every window in the neighborhood felt like an eye. Every tree felt like a witness. I looked down at the cellar bulkhead. The wooden doors were closed. They were old, the paint peeling in long, curled strips. I walked down the stairs. My legs felt like lead. I walked across the damp grass to the bulkhead. I reached down and grabbed the handle. It was locked from the outside with a heavy padlock. I knew it was locked. I had locked it myself months ago when we moved the lawnmower. There were no footprints in the mud around the doors. Mrs. Gable was losing her mind, I told myself. She was old. She was scared. She was imagining monsters in the mist. I turned to go back inside, but I stopped. There, on the white siding of the house, right next to the cellar doors, was a mark. It was a smudge of gray dust. It was in the shape of a hand, but the fingers were too long. They had too many joints. And as I watched, the smudge began to move. It didn't slide. It drifted. It moved upward toward the window of the study, leaving a faint, ashen trail behind it. I didn't run. I couldn't. I was mesmerized by the impossibility of it. I followed the trail. I walked around the side of the house, my eyes fixed on that gray smear. It reached the sill of the study window and stopped. I looked through the glass. The study was empty. The computer monitor was off. But sitting on the desk, right in the center of the blotter, was a small pile of something. I went back inside. I ran through the kitchen, through the hallway, and burst into the study. I went to the desk. The pile wasn't dust. It was hair, fine, dark hair, Elia's hair. It looked like it had been carefully shorn, laid out in a neat, circular mound. And next to it was a single scrap of paper. It was a page torn from a ledger. Not Elia's journal, but something older. The paper was yellowed and brittle. On it was written a list of names. 1924, Thomas. 1951, Arthur. 1978, Julian. 2002, Malachi. And at the bottom, in fresh, wet ink, 2024, Elias. The pacing of my heart accelerated. The room began to spin. I wasn't just losing a husband, I was watching a cycle. I looked at the window. Reflected in the glass, I saw the door behind me. It was closing, but it wasn't the house closing it. I saw a hand, pale, long, and gray, gripping the edge of the wood. I spun around. The door slammed shut. Click. The lock engaged. I was in the room. I was in the box. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the victim. I looked at the pile of hair on the desk. I looked at the list of names. I reached out and picked up the pen. My hand moved without my permission. My fingers felt cold. My bones felt like they were turning to glass. I didn't write my name. I wrote, "I am the house." The moment the ink hit the paper, the fog outside the window turned black. The walls began to hum. And from the ceiling above me, I heard the sound of someone walking. Heavy, deliberate. The sound of someone who finally had enough room to move. I sat in Elia's chair. I didn't feel afraid anymore. I felt expected. Chapter 8, The Forgotten Memory. I sat in the chair. My hands were resting on the armrests. My fingers aligned perfectly with the worn patches in the fabric where Elia's, or whoever had been here, had placed his own. The hum in the walls was no longer a sound. It was a vibration in my marrow. I looked at the list of names on the desk. Thomas, Arthur, Julian, Malachi, Elias, my name wasn't there. Not yet. I looked down at the floor. Specifically at the gap between the desk and the rug. There was a scratch in the hardwood, a deep, curved gouge as if something heavy had been dragged in a circle over and over again. I stared at that scratch. Suddenly, the smell of the room changed. The scent of old paper and cedar vanished. It was replaced by the smell of wet wool and metallic, iron-rich earth. The room didn't change, but my mind did. A memory, one I hadn't touched in 25 years, tore through the floor of my consciousness. It wasn't a hazy recollection. It was a violent, technicolor intrusion. I am 8 years old. The sun is hot, but the air under the maple tree is cool. I am wearing a yellow dress. My knees are scraped. I am not alone. There are two of them. They are identical, but I know the difference. Everyone else sees two boys. I see a light and a shadow. Elias is the light. He shares his candy. He points out the birds. Malachi is the shadow. He doesn't speak. He just watches. He looks at me with eyes that feel like they are reaching inside my head, pulling at my thoughts. "Let's play a game," Malachi says. His voice is too old for an 8-year-old. It has a weight to it. "What game?" I ask. "The house game," he says. "We go into the dark. The house picks one of us. The one it picks stays. The one it doesn't gets to be real." Elias shakes his head. "I don't like that game, "You're afraid," Malachi says. "You're afraid the house won't pick you. You're afraid you aren't strong enough to be the shadow." We go to the cellar bulkhead. The wooden doors are warm from the sun. Malachi opens them. The darkness inside smells of damp and old things. "Sarah has to watch," Malachi says. "She has to be the witness. That's how the house knows it's true." I stand at the top of the stairs. The boys descend. 1, 2, 3 steps. They disappear into the black. I wait. The silence is absolute. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own heart, thin and fast. Then a scream. It isn't a loud scream. It's a muffled, wet sound, a sound of something being squeezed. I don't run. I can't. I am the witness. A minute passes, maybe an hour. A figure emerges from the dark. He is wearing a blue shirt. He has a smudge of dirt on his cheek. He looks at me and smiles. "It's okay, Sarah," he says. "The game is over." "Where's Malachi?" I ask. "Who?" the boy asks. His eyes are wide. They are bright. They are full of a quiet, steady intelligence. "Your brother," I say. My voice is trembling. "I don't have a brother, Sarah," he says. "I'm an only child, don't you remember?" And in that moment, as I looked into his eyes, I realized I didn't remember. The memory of Malachi began to dissolve like sugar in water. I looked at the cellar doors, and I saw only one boy. I looked at the yard, and I saw only one shadow. "I remember," I whispered. I blinked. I was back in the study. The yellow dress was gone. The smell of wet wool remained. I looked at my hands. They were shaking. I hadn't just moved to this town 6 years ago. I had returned. I had grown up 3 blocks away. My parents had moved us after the accident, they called it. The day I fell down the stairs and imagined a boy who didn't exist. The doctors called it a dissociative event, trauma-induced fantasy. I had spent my entire adult life believing I was a woman from the city who met a quiet man named Elias and fell in love. But I didn't meet him. I waited for him. And he didn't find me. I called him. I realized now why the house felt like a witness. It wasn't witnessing Elias' disappearance. It was witnessing my return. The Elias I had lived with for 6 years wasn't a man. He was a placeholder. He was the version of the boy who came out of the cellar, the version I had agreed to believe in so I wouldn't have to remember the scream. I looked at the list of names again. 2024, Elias. He wasn't erased by the house. He was erased by me. Every time I looked at the clock instead of him. Every time I treated him as a habit instead of a person, I was thinning the veil. I was making room. I stood up. My legs felt strong now. The vertigo was gone. Malachi, I said. The name didn't feel like a stone anymore. It felt like a key. The scratching on the door started again, but it wasn't on the outside. It was coming from inside the desk. I looked at the center drawer, the one I had already searched, the one that held the paper clips and the car wash receipt. I pulled it open. It was empty. But I reached my hand into the back, feeling for the seam. My fingers found a small, recessed button. I pressed it. A false bottom popped up. Inside was a single object, a small silver whistle. It was tarnished, covered in a fine layer of gray dust. I picked it up. It was cold. I knew what it was. It was the whistle Malachi used to call the dogs. The one he said could call things that weren't dogs if you blew it the right way. I put the whistle to my lips. I didn't blow. I just held it there. The house held its breath. I realized then that the truth wasn't in the walls. It wasn't in the basement. The truth was that there was never an Elias. There was only the boy who survived and the boy who waited. And I was the one who decided which was which. I looked at the window. The black fog was pressing against the glass, so thick it looked like solid stone. "I'm sorry," I whispered. I wasn't sure who I was talking to. Elias, Malachi, myself. From the corner of the room where the shadows were deepest, a voice spoke. "Don't be sorry, Sarah," it said. It was a voice I recognized. It was the voice of the detective, Vance. But when I turned to look, there was no man in a trench coat. There was only a shape. A silhouette that was too tall, with limbs that had too many joints. "The police aren't coming back," the shape said. "They never were. You don't call the police on a house. You call a priest or an architect." The shape stepped into the dim light of the computer monitor. It didn't have a face. It had a smudge, a suggestion of features. "Vance?" I asked. "Vance is a name you gave to the part of you that wanted to be caught," the shape said. "But you aren't a suspect, Sarah. You're the architect." The shape reached out a hand, a long, gray hand. "It's time to finish the drawing," it said. I looked at the whistle. I looked at the list. I realized that the first lie wasn't something I told the police. It was the lie I told myself the day I stood at the top of the cellar stairs and decided to see only one boy. The memory was fully formed now. I didn't just watch them go into the dark. I was the one who pushed the door shut. I was the one who turned the bolt. I was the one who wanted to see which one would come back first. I was the house. I always had been. Chapter 9, The Real Disappearance. I stood in the center of the bedroom. The air was perfectly still, yet I felt a draft not from a window but from the objects in the room. They felt thin, translucent. I walked to the closet, Elia's side. I reached out and pulled the handle. It didn't groan. It didn't make a sound at all. I looked at the hangers. Empty, not cleared out, not stolen. Empty as if they had never held a single thread of cotton or wool. There were no indentations on the carpet where his shoes had sat. There was no scent of cedar or cologne. I turned to the dresser. I pulled out the top drawer, the one where he kept his socks, and the small wooden box for his watch. It was empty. The wood inside was pristine, devoid of the lint and dust that accumulates over years of use. I felt a cold, hollow sensation in my chest. A disappearance is when something is taken. This was different. This was a retraction. I ran back to the hallway, to the photos on the wall, the hike in the Adirondacks, our wedding day. I stopped in front of the wedding photo. I was there. I was wearing the white lace dress. I was holding a bouquet of dried lavender. I was smiling, my head tilted to the side, looking at the person standing next to me. But there was no one there. In the photo, I was holding my arm out, my hand curled as if it were resting in the crook of a man's elbow. but the space beside me was just the blurred green background of the park. My hand was grasping at nothing. I looked at the Adirondacks photo. It was a picture of a mountain trail. I was in the frame, sitting on a rock, laughing. I was holding a water bottle out to someone off camera, but there were no second sets of footprints in the dirt. Elia's, I whispered. The name felt like ash on my tongue. It didn't feel like a name anymore. It felt like a sound I had made up to fill the silence. I walked to the bathroom. I needed to see my face. I needed to confirm that I, at least, was real. I leaned over the sink and looked into the mirror. I saw myself. The pale skin. The dark circles under my eyes. The heavy wool sweater. But then I looked closer. I looked at my right hand, the one resting on the porcelain. I wasn't wearing a wedding ring. There was no tan line. There was no indentation in the skin. My finger was smooth, unbroken by the mark of a decade-long habit. I reached for my neck, for the silver chain Elias had given me on our 3rd anniversary. My hand met only skin. I closed my eyes. Memory is a painting, Vance had said. You add a little color here. You blur a detail there. But what if I hadn't just painted the details? What if I had painted the entire subject? I walked back to the kitchen. I went to the junk drawer. I needed to find the ring. The one I had hidden. The one the police had photographed. I pulled the drawer open. It was full of the usual things. Menus, pens that didn't work, a roll of twine, but there was no silver ring. There was no indentation in the dust. I realized then that I hadn't spoken to a detective named Vance. Not in a station, not in this house. I looked at the chair where he had sat. It was pushed neatly under the table. There was no coffee cup. There was no notebook. I remembered the sirens. I remembered the red and blue lights pulsing against the walls. I walked to the front window and looked out at the driveway. There were no tire tracks in the gravel. The neighbor, Mrs. Gable, she hadn't come to my porch. She hadn't talked about maiden names or balloons with the air let out. I was the only one who had been in this house. For how long? I went to the calendar hanging on the side of the fridge. It was a scenic calendar, covered bridges of New England. The month was November. I looked at the squares. They were all empty. No appointments. No dinner with Elias. No oil change. I looked at the year at the top of the page. 2018. It wasn't 2024. I felt the floor tilt. I gripped the edge of the counter. I haven't been married for 8 years. I haven't been living a routine life in a quiet house. I looked at the sink. The 2 plates I had scraped were sitting in the drying rack. They were both clean. They were both mine. I hadn't made potatoes. I hadn't smelled rosemary. I walked to the study door. This was the center. This was where the night everything stopped began. I didn't need a key. The door wasn't locked. It was standing wide open. I stepped inside. The room was empty. No desk. No computer. No chair. No black journal. It was a storage room. It was filled with boxes. My boxes. The ones from the apartment I had lived in before my parents died. The ones I had never unpacked because I was too busy building a life with a man who wasn't there. I sat down on a box of old books. I realized the real disappearance wasn't Elias. It was me. I had spent 6 years, or was it more, living in a curated dream. I had invented a husband to talk to. I had invented arguments to feel alive. I had invented a mystery to explain why I felt so hollow. Elias, I said again. The house didn't even echo the name. It swallowed it. I looked at the wall where I thought I had heard the heartbeat. I stood up and walked to it. I pressed my ear to the plaster. I didn't hear a heart. I heard a clock. Tick, tick, tick. It was the clock from the kitchen. It was the only sound in the house. It was the sound of time passing for a person who isn't doing anything with it. I looked at my hands. They were starting to look pale. Faded. I realized that if I didn't find the truth, the actual truth of what happened in this house, I would vanish too, not like a man through a locked door, like a thought that someone forgot to finish. I looked at the back wall of the study, the one behind the boxes. There was a seam in the wallpaper, a small, vertical line where the floral pattern didn't quite match up. It wasn't a folding of the house. It wasn't a supernatural warping. It was a door that had been papered over. I reached out and touched the seam. My fingers didn't feel cold anymore. They felt electric. I knew what was behind that wall. It wasn't Elia's. It was the boy who didn't come out of the cellar. And he was the only thing in this house that was actually real. I grabbed the edge of the wallpaper and pulled. The paper screamed as it tore. Chapter 10, The Room Behind the Wall. The wallpaper didn't come away in clean strips. It shrieked. It was dry, brittle, and bonded to the plaster by 40 years of neglect. It felt like I was skinning the house. Underneath the floral lilies was a layer of gray, textured backing, and under that wood, I didn't stop. My fingernails were raw, the tips of my fingers stinging, but I kept clawing. I was a woman possessed by a sudden, violent need for geometry. I needed the house to make sense. If the study was 12 feet long on the outside, but only 10 feet long on the inside, those 2 feet had to be somewhere. Finally, a section of the wood gave way. Not a door, but a panel. A narrow, vertical slab of oak that had been fitted into the frame with surgical precision. There was no handle, only a small, circular hole where a lock might have been. I reached into my pocket. My fingers closed around the silver whistle I had found in the desk. It wasn't a key, but the end of it, the narrow mouthpiece, was the exact diameter of the hole. I inserted the whistle. I turned it. Thunk! The sound was heavy, deep. It was the sound of a heart finally skipping the beat it had been holding for 25 years. The panel swung inward. The air that rushed out wasn't cold. It was dead. It was air that had been breathed once, a long time ago, and then forgotten. It smelled of cedar, pencil shavings, and a faint, lingering scent of something metallic. I stepped through the gap. I was standing in a room that was barely wider than my outstretched arms. It was long and narrow, a sliver of a space carved out between the study and the exterior wall. It was a bedroom. There was a narrow cot against the far wall. The blankets were pulled tight, tucked in with military precision. On the floor next to the cot was a pair of shoes, small shoes, brown leather with scuffed toes, the shoes of a child. I walked further into the room. Every step felt like I was treading on glass. There was a small desk in the corner. On the desk was a lamp with a green glass shade. I reached out and pulled the string. It didn't work. Of course, it didn't. The wires were likely dead, the bulb shattered by time, but I had my phone. I turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating a world frozen in 1999. On the walls, there were drawings. Not the typical drawings of a child, no houses with curly smoke, no stick figure families. These were technical drawings, schematics of the house, cross-sections of the hallways, diagrams of the ventilation system, maps of the crawl spaces, and in the center of every drawing there was a red X. The X was always in the same place, the study. I moved the light to the desk. There was a notebook. It was identical to the one I thought I had found in Elia's desk earlier, the black-bound journal. I opened it. The handwriting was the jagged, aggressive script I had seen on the last page of the other book. Day 412. It read, "She still thinks I'm him. She calls me Elia's. She brings me tea. She looks at me and sees a boy who smiles. She doesn't know that the boy who smiles is still in the cellar. He's the one who stayed in the dark. I'm the one who took the shape." I felt the room begin to pulse. Day 600, the house is helping. It's growing new skin over the door. Soon, there won't be a room here at all. There will just be the hallway. There will just be the study. And I will be the only version left. If I say his name enough, maybe I'll believe it too. I turned the pages, my breath hitching in my throat. Day 2190. Sarah is back. She doesn't remember the game. She looks at me and her eyes are full of a quiet, steady love. It's a lie, but it's a beautiful one. I will live in this lie until the house takes me back. The last entry was dated 2 days ago. She's starting to see the edges. The wallpaper is thinning. The silence is speaking. I can hear the real Elias calling from the walls. He wants his name back. I have to go. I have to lock the door from the inside one last time. I dropped the notebook. I looked at the far end of the narrow room. There was a mirror hanging on the wall, a small, oval mirror with a silver frame. I walked toward it. I didn't want to see what was in the reflection. I was terrified that I would see the faceless man, or the detective, or the boy with the dark, flat eyes. I stood in front of the mirror. I saw myself, but I wasn't alone. Standing behind me in the reflection of the narrow room was a man. He was wearing a blue sweater. He was wearing glasses. He looked quiet. He looked steady. He looked like Elias. But he wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a monster. He was a memory. "You found it," he said. His voice didn't come from the room. It came from inside my own head. "Who are you?" I whispered. "I'm the part of you that needed to be loved," he said. "And Malachi was the part of you that knew the truth." "What truth?" The man in the mirror stepped closer. He placed a hand on my shoulder. I couldn't feel the weight of it, but I felt the coldness of the space where his hand should be. "There were never two boys, Sarah," he said softly. I froze. "Think back," he urged. "To the cellar, to the game." I closed my eyes. I went back to the stairs, the yellow dress. The two boys, one light, one shadow. I looked closer at the memory. I saw the boy on the left, Elias. I saw the boy on the right, Malachi. And then the memory shifted. The light changed. The two boys merged. There was only one boy. He was standing in the center of the cellar, talking to himself. He was changing his voice. He was shifting his posture. He was playing both roles. He was a lonely, brilliant child who had created a brother because the house was too big for one person, and I was the girl who had agreed to play along. "Malachi didn't disappear," the man in the mirror said. "He just stopped being the brother. He became the man. He became the husband. He became the person you needed him to be." "Then why is he gone now?" I asked, tears blurring my vision. "Because you stopped needing the lie," he said. "Because you started looking for the X. And once you find the room behind the wall, the game has to end." I looked around the small, narrow room. This wasn't a prison for a brother. It was a shrine to a delusion. Every drawing, every note, every scuffed shoe, it was all evidence of a mind trying to hold onto a reality that didn't exist. Elias Thorne didn't exist. Malachi Thorne didn't exist. There was only a boy who lived in an old house and a girl who came back to find him. And when the boy died, years ago, of a quiet, lonely heart, the house kept his shape for me. It kept the routine. It kept the potatoes and the rosemary and the ticking clock, until I decided to look behind the wallpaper. The man in the mirror began to fade. "Wait!" I cried out. "Don't go. I don't want to be alone." "You're not alone, Sarah," he said. His voice was a faint vibration now, like the hum of the fridge. "The silence is finally speaking. Listen." I stayed perfectly still. The hum in the walls stopped. The ticking of the clock in the kitchen stopped. The wind outside the house died away. For the first time in my life, I heard it, the sound of the house breathing. It was a slow, deep rhythmic expansion and contraction of the air, in, out, and in that breath I heard the voices of everyone who had ever lived here. Thomas, Arthur, Julian. They weren't names on a list, they were layers of the house. I looked at the desk. The black notebook was gone. I looked at the shoes. They were gone. The narrow room was empty. It was just a space between two walls, a gap in the architecture. I walked out of the room, back into the study. The panel slid shut behind me. The wallpaper seemed to knit itself back together, the lilies and vines aligning once more. I stood in the center of the study. The room was full of light. The blue monitor was off. The sun was shining through the window, casting long, golden rectangles across the carpet. I looked at the desk. There was a single plate sitting there. A half-eaten sandwich, a glass of water. There were no potatoes. There was no rosemary. I looked at the door. It was open. I walked into the hallway. The photos on the wall were different. They weren't of a couple. They were of me at graduation, me at my first job, me standing in front of this house on the day I bought it, alone. I went to the kitchen. The clock on the wall was gone. There was only a pale circle on the paint where it had been. I looked at the table, one chair. I sat down. I felt a strange sense of peace. The terror was gone. The confusion was gone. The silence wasn't a threat anymore. It was a conversation. I realized that Elias hadn't disappeared. He had simply been returned to the house. He was in the floorboards. He was in the paint. He was in the way the light hit the sink. He was the silence. And the silence finally spoke. It said, "It's okay to be alone, Sarah. You've always been good at it." I picked up my fork and began to eat. The house watched me. And for the first time, I didn't mind being seen. Chapter 11, Confession Without Words. The afternoon sun shifted across the floor, measuring the time in inches of light. I didn't move. I sat at the kitchen table, watching the way a single dust mote drifted through a sunbeam. It spiraled, rose, and fell, governed by currents of air I couldn't feel. There were no sirens. There was no knock at the door from a detective with gray eyes and a heavy coat. The world outside the windows continued to turn, indifferent to the fact that a man had just been unmade. I stood up slowly. My joints felt stiff, like old hinges. I walked into the living room. I looked at the armchair, the one that had been breathing the night before. It was just an armchair. A piece of foam and fabric I had bought at a clearance sale 3 years ago. It wasn't breathing. It wasn't even comfortable. I went to the coat rack in the hall. I reached out and touched the empty pegs. I realized I had been seeing a blue parka there for years. I had brushed against it every time I left the house. I had even adjusted the hanger when it looked crooked, but my hand met only cold wood. There was no coat. There never had been. This was the confession. It didn't require a lawyer or a recorded statement. It was a silent admission between my eyes and my brain. "I see you," I told the empty peg. "I see that you are nothing." I walked to the study. The door was still open. The wallpaper was smooth, the seam of the hidden room invisible once more. I sat at the desk. I picked up a pen, a real pen, one that worked. I pulled a blank sheet of paper toward me. I thought about writing a letter. To whom? To the neighbors, to the police, to the ghost of a boy who never grew up. I realized there were no words for this. How do you describe the shape of a vacuum? How do you explain that you spent half a decade sharing your bed with a memory and your heart with a hallucination? Instead of writing, I began to clear the desk. I picked up the black journal, the one I had imagined Elias writing in. As my fingers touched the cover, the texture changed. It didn't feel like leather anymore. It felt like cheap plastic. I opened it. The pages were blank. Every entry I had read, the weather reports, the notes about the house, the final chilling warning, they were all gone. Or rather, they had never been there. I had projected them onto the empty white space, my mind acting as a film reel, the paper as the screen. I didn't cry. Crying felt like something Sarah and Delia's would do. And she was gone. I took the journal to the kitchen. I opened the door to the small wood-burning stove I used in the winter. I dropped the book inside. I struck a match. I watched the edges of the paper curl. I watched the white pages turn black, then gray, then ash. The fire didn't make a sound. It was a quiet, hungry heat. As the book burned, I felt the house lighten. It was a physical sensation, like a pressure being released from my inner ear. The corners of the ceiling seemed to lift. The hallway felt wider. The shadow under the cellar door didn't look like a mouth anymore, it just looked like a shadow. I went to the bedroom. I looked at the bed. It was a king size. I had bought it because we needed the space. I walked to the right side of the bed, his side. I sat down on the edge of the mattress. I reached out and touched the pillow. It was cool. It was perfectly plump. No head had rested there last night. No breath had warmed the fabric. I lay down. I placed my head on his pillow. I closed my eyes and tried to conjure him one last time. I tried to see the blue sweater. I tried to hear the sound of his keyboard. I tried to feel the way he would reach for my hand in the middle of the night when he had a bad dream. Nothing. The projector was broken. The film had run out. I was just a woman lying in a large bed in a quiet house in a town that didn't know her. And that was the emotional climax. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a breakdown. It was the simple, devastating weight of the truth. I realized that for 6 years, I hadn't been lonely. I had been occupied. I had filled every spare second of my life with the maintenance of a ghost. I had cooked for him, cleaned for him, argued with him, and worried about him. Without him, I was a hollow vessel. I sat up. I looked at my reflection in the dressing table mirror. I looked older, but I also looked clearer. The soft edges Elias had complained about were gone. I was sharp. I was defined. I stood up and walked to the window. The fog had finally lifted. The street was visible now. I saw a car drive by. I saw a dog walker. I saw the world continuing its mundane, beautiful business. I went to the bathroom and turned on the shower. I let the water get hot, very hot. I stepped in and let the steam fill the room. I washed my hair. I scrubbed my skin until it was red. I washed away the smell of the house. I washed away the scent of cedar and old paper. When I stepped out, I didn't reach for the towel I usually left out for him. I reached for mine. I looked at the bathroom mirror, fogged over with steam. I raised my hand. I didn't write Malachi. I didn't write help. I wiped a small circle in the center of the glass so I could see my own eyes. I looked at myself for a long time. "You're here," I whispered. The words didn't echo. They didn't vibrate in the walls. They were just words. I walked back into the bedroom, dressed in a simple robe. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief, not for Elias, but for the version of me that needed him. I felt sorry for the girl who had been so afraid of the silence that she had built a man out of it. I went to the kitchen and made a cup of tea. 1 cup. I sat at the table. I looked at the empty chair across from me. I didn't imagine a man sitting there. I didn't wait for a creak in the floorboards. I just drank my tea. The house was silent, but it wasn't the silence of a tomb. It was the silence of a clean slate. I was alone, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was the only light left in the house, and that was enough. Chapter 12. The silence remains. Winter arrived in earnest 3 weeks later. The first snow was not a flurry, it was a burial. It fell in thick, heavy flakes that muted the world, turning the driveway into a white sheet and the maple tree into a jagged, skeletal claw. I sat by the window in the living room. I had a blanket over my lap. I had a book in my hand. I hadn't turned the page in an hour. The house was warm. I had fixed the draft near the cellar door. I had replaced the flickering ballast in the kitchen light. The mechanical heart of the home was functioning perfectly. The police had stopped coming by. Actually, they had only come once after that first night. Not Vance, never Vance, just Officer Miller. He hadn't come to investigate a disappearance. He had come because a neighbor, Mrs. Gable, had called about a woman standing in her yard in the middle of the night, screaming at a darkened window. He had been kind. He had suggested I see someone. He had talked about grief and prolonged isolation. I had nodded, I had thanked him, I had closed the door. He didn't ask where Elias was. He didn't ask about the locked study. To him, there was no missing person. There was only a woman living in a house that was too large for her. The case was officially closed. Not because it was solved, but because there was no case to begin with. You cannot file a report for a ghost. I looked toward the hallway. The study door was open. I had moved my sewing machine in there. I had replaced the heavy oak desk with a light folding table. The room was bright. It was airy. But sometimes, when the sun hit the wallpaper at a certain angle, I could still see the seam. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew what was back there. A narrow space. A dead dream. A handful of drawings made by a boy who didn't know how to be real. I lived with the truth now. The truth is a quiet companion. It doesn't argue. It doesn't leave glasses of water on the nightstand. It doesn't make the floorboards creak. It just sits in the corner of the room, watching. People in town look at me differently now. When I go to the grocery store, they lower their voices. They see a widow, even though there was no funeral. They see a woman who lost something they can't quite name. They think I am haunted by a tragedy. They don't realize I am haunted by a construction. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. I looked at the counter. I remembered the steam from the potatoes. I remembered the smell of rosemary. It was a beautiful memory. It was as vivid as any real thing I had ever experienced. And that was the most chilling part of all. I could make it happen again if I wanted to. I could close my eyes, hold my breath, and call him back. I could build him out of the shadows and the silence. I could make the chair creak. I could make the door lock from the inside. I have the blueprints now. I am the architect. But I don't. I choose the silence. Because the silence is honest. The silence doesn't ask me to be someone I'm not. The silence doesn't require me to ignore the edges of the world. I walked back to the living room and turned off the lamp. The house was plunged into the blue-gray light of a snowy evening. I looked at the spot where Elias used to sit. There was nothing there, no indentation in the cushion, no lingering warmth. I realized then that I had been wrong about the house. It hadn't been taking things. It hadn't been folding in on itself. It had been waiting for me to stop filling it with lies. A house is just a box. It only holds what you put inside. And if you put a person in a box who doesn't exist, eventually the box will find a way to spit them out. I stood in the center of the dark room. I felt thin. I felt light. I looked at the photos on the wall, the new ones, photos of landscapes, photos of the ocean, photos where the space beside me was intentionally, beautifully empty. I reached out and touched the wall. The plaster was cold. I thought about all the people who have lived in this house. Thomas, Arthur, Julian, Malachi, Elias, they are all gone now, not because they died, not because they left. They were simply withdrawn, like a hand pulled back into a sleeve. I walked to the stairs. My footsteps were light. They didn't echo. I reached the landing and looked down into the dark well of the hallway. I wasn't afraid. I knew that if I went into the study and tore down the wallpaper again, the room would be gone. The space would be filled with solid stone. The house had finished that chapter. It had moved on. I went into my bedroom. I lay down in the center of the bed. I listened to the snow hitting the window. SHHH. SHHH, SHHH. It was the sound of the world being smoothed over. The sound of tracks being covered. I closed my eyes. I am Sarah Thorne. I live alone. I have a house with 12 rooms. One of them is hidden. One of them is silent. And the rest are mine. I thought about the word disappear. It sounds so active. It sounds like a choice, a magician's trick. A puff of smoke and a sudden absence. But that's not what happened here. Elias didn't leave. He didn't die. He didn't vanish into the woods or the fog. I looked at the dark ceiling one last time before sleep took me. Some people don't disappear. They're erased.